Okay, so good morning, everyone in the room. And also, I understand we have quite a group of online audience. Good morning to you as well. So if you were here yesterday, so we have done quite a lot of things yesterday. So I reflected last night. So we have covered China and Africa trade relationship, investment and debt problem. We have seen different research methods, quantitative research and qualitative research as well. So the only thing that we did not touch upon is FOCAC. And that word was basically forbidden yesterday because we want to know more and in depth about this FOCAC thing. We did touch upon what is that? Strategic partnership. So we talked about that, but then we stopped expanding the meaning of it. So I think Hannah will have a lot of things to say about this strategic partnership, on this FOCAC. More importantly for us, what is going to happen after FOCAC? So now I need a little bit my details. So Hannah, actually, we are very pleased to introduce you, Ms. Hannah Ryder. So Hannah is the CEO of Development Reimagined, which is a very influential consultancy focusing on African, focusing on everything, international development. I think Hannah has done quite a lot on Africa, particularly, and China as well. So Hannah is a former diplomat and economist with over 20 years of experience. And she was named as one of the 100 most influential Africans in 2021. And Hannah is also a senior associate for the African program of the Center for Strategic International Studies. We all know this, CSIS. And Hannah also sits on the board of Environmental Defense Fund. She's a member of UAE's International Advisory Council on the New Economy. And she's also a special advisor for the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers for the Organization of Southern Cooperation. It's quite something that I do not know. And before Hannah took the responsibility of this company, consultancy, and she was involved in a lot of projects with UN and also, I think, OECD. And she was, I think I saw something, she co-authored the Stern Report, and that was very influential as well. So I hope, Anna, you have recovered. I mean, for people who follow the FOCAC, I at least saw Anna a couple of times on TV, and particularly on live, on CGTN. So I followed everything. So I met Hannah on TV before we see each other today. So Hannah is very active. She flies, in different continents. So I hope you recovered. I know you were in China last week. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. And that's something that everybody is so interested in knowing more in depth. So Hannah, you will have 30 minutes, about 30 minutes, and see whether, I'm sure you can generate a lot of questions. Okay, so the floor is yours, Hannah. So please.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you to AERC, ODI, and SOAS for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. I literally arrived from Beijing last night around 7 p.m. So please forgive me if I'm a little bit slow or if I muddle up my words or something like that. But I'm going to do my very best to give you as much of a readout as myself and my team have been working on of FOCAC and what we expect for the coming years. I should also say, Professor was talking about having been on lots of TV and so on. I was on CGTN for President Xi's speech, so doing the live responses to that. But we were also involved with several of our partners in China in doing supporting a number of events and discussions and reports that came out in advance of FOCAC to help build up for certain outcomes and so on. So hopefully, if you follow Development Reimagined, you'll have seen some of that work. We usually try and make as much of it as public as possible. But really always what you might hopefully know from Development Reimagined's work is we really try to center the African continent, African interests, and African policies, existing policies, both at a national level and a full regional level, continental level, in our work, and then look outward. That's usually the point of view. And so that's hopefully also what will come across today in this presentation. So since I've just come back from China, I will do a presentation about what we think about the cooperation post-FOCAC. And as you know, FOCAC was just held just last week. And there were 3 particular documents that came out, plus, as always, President Xi's speech itself had a number of announcements. So this is a usual way with FOCAC. You always look out for the announcements within the speech, but you also then look at the declarations and the action plans and any other documents that come out to really to see what those really mean in practice, or at least get a bit more of an understanding of what those mean in practice. This FOCAC, there was one extra document. The last FOCAC 2021, which I also attended, this is my 4th FOCAC. I first went to the one in 2015 as a UN rep, observing, and have been to every single one since. And the 2021, even though it was there were several African presidents there. However, President Xi himself could only participate virtually. Wanjie was there as well. But there was still some very important outcomes from that. And there were 4 documents that came out: an action plan, a declaration, and then a declaration on climate change, and also something called a new a Vision 2035, which kind of anchors even some of the announcements that were made for this FOCAC 2024. So we have to remember that every single FOCAC itself sort of builds up on what has been achieved previously. And so in today's presentation, I'll be making several references. You'll see a lot of comparisons today to what happened in 2021 as well, so that we understand that context. I'm just going to move on to the next slide, first of all. If I can. Yeah. Oh. Okay, perfect. I can use these. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So the presentation today that I'm going to give you, I'm going to go through a number of different areas and issues, finishing with what next. But you will get a preview of what next as I cover all these outcomes. We'll begin with politics and themes, then we'll go to financial outcomes, then trade outcomes, then the investment and industry or industrialization outcomes, climate outcomes, and then development outcomes. And just remember also, development outcomes are obviously, everything is all about development. At least that's my view. Finance and trade, investment should all be about development and be moving towards development. But in this context, we're speaking specifically about aid projects and the direction of those sorts of activities. So that's what I will cover in that almost final section, and then I'll talk a little bit about what next. So FOCAC 2024, I think we can be very clear that it was a very well-attended FOCAC. It was the most well-attended FOCAC ever. 51 heads of state and government joined personally, plus the presidential representatives of 2 African countries. And one of the presidents didn't come because they had just been on a state visit to China. So it would be difficult to kind of justify. So it was really the most well-attended FOCAC, also the most well-attended Africa +1 summit. Previous record was 2014 for US-Africa when Barack Obama was president. So what does that mean anything? I mean, why did they all turn up? Why did they all accept that invitation? That's a really good point. Well, certainly from the Chinese point of view, it provided the basis for an upgrading of the overall relationship in a political sense. So previous to this, China had what's known as all-weather friendships. It's kind of highest tier in foreign policy friendships or agreements or partnerships with 5 different countries around the world, only one of which was African, which is Ethiopia. But this FOCAC meant that the entire African continent is then all weather, which means that Africa becomes significantly more central to Chinese foreign policy. So that's a really important outcome to bear in mind. In addition to that, every country has its own individual kind of tier within, again, Chinese foreign policy and diplomatic relations. And what happened was, there were around 20 African countries, a little bit less than 20 African countries that didn't have what's known as a strategic partnership with China prior to FOCAC. And all of them were upgraded to that level, at least. And then there were a few other agreements, especially with the state visits. So not every single president was doing a state visit, even though they got a bilateral with President Xi. Not every single one was doing a state visit, but the ones that did do a state visit and a few others actually did upgrade many of their relationships as well. So again, it's sort of, they became more central to Chinese foreign policy. And what we also saw, if you look through the declarations and the action plan, a lot of reiteration of Agenda 2063, which is Africa's blueprint for development, and also some of the key regional initiatives, AFCFTA, of course, but also some very new ones, which also meant that African countries were certainly putting forward, their the most recent initiatives saying we want Chinese support for this, and they were able to get that. So Africa CDC, the African Medicines Agency, Africa CDC, of course, we know that was recognized in 2021 as well. But the African Medicines Agency, the African the African Credit Rating Agency, which is still being worked on, the Pan-African payment systems, all of these were mentioned in the Declarational Action Plan. So it's also important to think of it from African organizations and African governments saying, we also want some recognition, and they did get that recognition through FOCAC. And then, on the other side also, we saw a lot of recognition, reiteration of Chinese foreign policies in particular, Global Security Initiative, Global Cultural Initiative, and the Global Development Initiative. And that's the third document that came out for FOCAC, which was a declaration about Africa and Africa's perspective on the Global Development Initiative. So that was the third document that came out specially for FOCAC. And so again, provides quite an important basis for going forward. So I think just from this part, we see just from the political outcomes, we can expect in terms of what next, we can expect the African continent to be playing a stronger role in China's foreign policy and for China to continue to play an important role in Africa's foreign policy and economic policy as well, both at the national and the regional level. The overall theme, if you go to President Xi's speech in particular, was modernization. And again, with every single FOCAC, again, most of you will know that there's always a way of organizing the new initiatives that come forward. With FOCAC 8, we had 9 programs. And with FOCAC 9, we've got 10 partnership actions. But each partnership action, if you go back to the speech, they all have modernization of XXX, modernization of YYY, modernization, 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 modernization is the theme throughout this. And it is a very important theme to consider. Why talk about modernization? And you have to look at, again, some of the wording in President Xi's speech in particular, where he also talks about the means of development. We can think of modernization as development, but the means of development and talking about certain paths of development which have not been in Africa's interest. And so really trying to suggest that China's partnership with African countries will be more in their interest than other countries' partnerships with Africa. So I think that's a very interesting nuance, but I think it comes out through this modernization theme in particular. But again, you'll see from the table that the actual sort of specific areas, thematic areas, they have expanded over time. We did a briefing just before FOCAC. You can go to it on the website, which shows you 50 or so themes that have come up through FOCAC over since 2000. But they kind of converge, and some of them go off a little bit, some of them come back in, some of them don't come back in at all. But here, you know, these are the ones that are seen as key for the moment. But you can see there's not a great deal of change from FOCAC 8. In fact, you can see green development is still there. Common security or peace and security still there. Where there is a sort of some shifts is still connectivity, but in FOCAC 8, it was talked more about digital innovation. We have much more of a theme around industrialization, again, linked with modernization. Who can modernize without industrializing? And then also development cooperation becomes something quite specific and separate to a degree from agriculture and livelihood. So there are some nuances, some shifts, but generally there is a continuity through FOCACs. And that's also important to bear in mind, because it means that issues or challenges can have an opportunity to be addressed over time because of that continuity. So let's go to some of the specific outcomes. Finance was the one that hit the headlines, of course. And I think the overall message was China's back. And I think that's from the perspective of most African countries. Because what we have to remember is that most African countries have not been able to get lending from China every year consistently. They work hard to try to get lending, and the same with African organizations. But it's that openness, and the overall pledges provide an opening for African countries to be able to say and aim for looking for certain loans or other types of financial outcomes with China. So I think that message was no doubt well received from African countries with the financial pledges. We'll look at them in detail. Specifically, the overall financial pledge was around 50 billion. If US dollars equivalent, it was mentioned in RMB. So that's slightly different to how it has been done in previous FOCACs. Just remember that. And that was a 10 billion increase overall compared to FOCAC 8. And we had what I'm showing you here is the overall outcomes at the top and some comparisons to FOCAC 8 and also some extra context if need be, where relevant. What we see is that in terms of how the 50 billion was broken down, we see more flexibility than 2021. 2021 had some very specific, we're going to tie this down to some trade specific outcomes. We're going to send 10 billion special drawing rights to Africa. And whereas this is much broader. So it allows for a lot more flexibility, a lot more creativity is something that we talked about before FOCAC as a likely trend with regards to finance. But also it included 10 billion of foreign direct investment, and we'll come back to this a little bit. That's the same amount as FOCAC 8, but also is in the context of a 100 billion of foreign direct investment stocks goal, which was set for 2035, and that was set at FOCAC 8, which is why that Vision 2035 document from FOCAC 8 still remains extremely important. And then there were some very specific outcomes for some of the development assistance. This would likely include different types of grants. Global Development Initiative, there is something called the Global Development Fund that is already in place. So that would come under this overall 10 billion of other forms of development assistance. And then as part of that, also some of the cancellation of debt. What was announced here was the usual announcements from FOCAC, cancellation of interest-free loans due to expire by that particular year is a very usual practice for China. Those interest-free loans don't really make up a great deal of lending from China, but they're still important. But nevertheless, also that 10 billion of development assistance because of other forms of development assistance. Again, it provides some flexibility for things like debt swaps, which have already been experimented with in China, in particular through Egypt. So just bear in mind that there is a lot more flexibility and creativity possible with these financial outcomes. But as I said, the overall message, China's back, and that was what many African governments were looking for from this FOCAC. Another area that many African governments were looking for with a partnership with China was on trade. Continued progress on market access to China, but also, and we'll come to this a little bit later, but a means to kind of upgrade the type of trade with China. What we had in FOCAC 9 was really a sort of, well, things have been going quite well since FOCAC 8, an assessment that things have been moving. We've had a significant diversification of African exports to China, especially in the agriculture arena. That was because of two specific measures which were introduced in FOCAC 8, which was the green lanes and also a number of acceleration in the ability of Chinese authorities to allow more agricultural products to come into China, SPS. So that all worked, and also there was a target in FOCAC 8 of 100. You break it down, it's 100 billion US dollars worth of African imports every year. That was met, and so it was a kind of, well, yeah, this is going fine. Let's keep going. But what we do have, there wasn't a new target from FOCAC 9 that's just gone, but what there was a new target specifically for agricultural imports from China, which again, we have an article on this prior to FOCAC, and we think that's fairly achievable, likely to be achievable, but also will be good if it's achieved for many African countries. And also we had a further opening up of tariff lines from China. Now, if you look at the opening up of tariff lines, the language in President Xi's speech is China's the first country to open up 100% of tariff lines for least developed countries. That's absolutely correct. Prior to this, many of those LDCs had 98 or 97% tariff access to zero tariffs to China anyway. So the extra 2 or 3% does have some important products in it. So we've looked at the list of products which were excluded and weren't excluded, things like rubber, soybean oil. So there are some products which are important to African countries that were having to pay tariffs to come into China, so it should make it easier for them. But it's also worth noting that, you know, China voluntarily did bring in the scheme back in 2003, when just after, sort of 2 years after joining the WTO. And so it is kind of important that China continues to do it, but it still excludes middle-income countries who are also looking for more market access to China. So that's what this sentence here, prepared to enter into framework agreements on economic partnership, is about. There's one African country so far, Mauritius, who has got a free trade arrangement with China. However, once again, if you look into the detail of that free trade agreement, it is highly preferential, especially with regards to goods, highly preferential towards Mauritius. So it's likely that that's what African countries would look at for economic partnership agreements. But I think the point here was to avoid the implication, the suggestion that China wants to do free trade arrangements with middle-income countries, because that would be interpreted as we're going to be letting Chinese products come into our countries without any tariffs, etc., which could be quite challenging for many African countries, and they already have significant trade deficits. Especially the middle-income countries have very strong trade deficits with China. So this would aim to correct some of that. But generally, I think no major new announcements in the area of trade, and that means things are going well. So let's keep going. There were some quite important outcomes when it comes to investment and industry. And as I mentioned, who can modernize without industrialization? And again, the message that I constantly heard every single president or, you know, finance minister, foreign minister, investment authority, whenever they're making speeches, the key phrase they said was value added. We want value addition. And that message was also a very strong message prior to FOCAC with the preparation that went on. And so the expectation is that while the 10 billion target for foreign direct investment will be maintained from 2021 and is the same for 2024 going forwards over the next 3 years, that 10 billion, the type of foreign direct investment will change or will become much more added value, especially with regards to critical minerals and natural resources, but also an increasing push around factories and logistics, which would then move towards industrialization, make industrialization more efficient. So yeah, a lot of the African delegations, we had quite significant African delegations from many countries, and what they were there to do was really to not just be at FOCAC, but really promote their countries. There were so many investment forums, DRC, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa, all promoting Kenya. They all had special sessions where they were promoting their countries and promoting new projects, but also foreign direct investment decisions, foreign direct investment locations and propositions. And many of them also, of course, had significant numbers of bilateral partner meetings with organizations like CAD Fund or, you know, and specific factories and so on. Many presidents also went to Shenzhen, which is also very interesting, which again indicated the kind of direction that that African countries are looking for, going to a special economic zone and how it's changed, getting that inspiration for modernization. So again, specifically, if we look at the shift from FOCAC 8 to FOCAC 9, we see a scaling up of some of the outcomes. So for example, in FOCAC 8, there was a commitment to carry out 10 regional connectivity projects. Here, FOCAC 9, we have 30. So a general scaling up, and again, that's in line with the overall financial commitment. If the finance is going up, that means that more projects can be done. So that was something that that was clearly, we saw that in several areas. Again, digital economy, 10 to 20, and then also an increase in the sort of jobs target. So in FOCAC 8, there was a kind of general encouragement of Chinese companies to create 800,000 jobs. Our expectation is that's a sort of cumulative, not within the 3 years. And so by the end of 2027, it should be a cumulative 1 million, so an additional 200,000 over the next 3 years of jobs to be created through Chinese investment, which is actually a lot. If you think about it, you would need quite a lot of new factories and spillover effects from those factories in order to make that happen. So it's really, it's quite significant. Another shift that we saw, so we saw a shift of scaling, a higher scale with investment and industry, but a very strong shift that was very clear with FOCAC 9 was a push on renewable energy or clean energy. Kenya, as the key country that brought African leaders together for the Africa Climate Summit in 2023, pushed very hard for recognition of the Nairobi Declaration and African aspirations in that sense, especially a 300 gigawatt target for renewable energy by 2030. Nairobi Declaration itself was mentioned, and then what the Chinese contribution to that might be, scaling up 30 green projects, clean energy projects. And you compare that to what was said in FOCAC, there was some expectation around energy cooperation, but it was very broad. And also the only serious commitment, in a sense, if it comes to clean energy, was just saying no new coal. So now the expectation is there's a big enough pipeline on clean energy that Chinese partners are aware of, and that African countries have talked to Chinese counterparts about, of clean energy projects, that you can have this actual commitment of 30 projects that China would be involved in, financing likely to some degree, if not the entire project. So there was the continued themes on adaptation, disaster management, but that's the disaster management and biodiversity has increased. Again, we expect that to be a push both from China and Africa. China obviously did quite a lot on biodiversity recently, hosting the conference, etc. And then something new, a new China-Africa forum on peaceful use of nuclear technology, which is also quite interesting to note. So last but not least, development cooperation outcomes. What did those look like? In line with the overall increase in finance expected, several of the specific outcomes on development were scaled up. Like we said, like I mentioned also with the regional connectivity, digital connectivity, digital cooperation, clean energy, the finance allows for a bigger scaling up of ambition. And so we see some of that. So again, if you look at, for example, the health programs, FOCAC 8, just 10, FOCAC 9, we're going to go to 20. There's going to last in FOCAC 8, 10,000 high-level African professionals being invited to train in China. This time it's 60,000. So a major push. And that should bring training and student numbers up in China back, hopefully, to pre-COVID levels. One of the areas that China was really excelling in terms of bringing African students to China. That should help. And I think the emphasis on women and youth is also really interesting, and something that, again, several countries and several ambassadors were really trying to work really hard on. And we, of course, in some of the development areas, we see a slight shift. So the FOCAC 8 in health, for example, and I think this is a point to talk about the responsiveness of FOCAC, right? So there was this commitment around vaccine doses and vaccine local production in FOCAC 8. You don't need to have that kind of cooperation specific anymore, but that local manufacturing theme still continues. The investment in African local pharmaceutical production continued, and again was a major theme, a major push from the UN, especially there. So I think there's some of the overall outcomes were quite specific as well. But I also want to make clear one of the very important implications of the Global Development Initiative discussion and how it was framed in President Xi's speech. Because prior to COVID, there had been a lot of talk about how Chinese lending and Chinese finance is going to be scaling down, right? Even though in the Belt and Road Forum, when President Xi did the speech there, he said, we will continue flagship projects, which are big because they're flagship, and we'll do small and beautiful. But somehow lots of people forgot that he said flagship projects and were like, everything's going to be small and beautiful. But that's not the case. So small and beautiful in the speech and also in the declaration is associated with the development initiatives. It is about development initiatives. Small and beautiful is about development initiatives that make a positive impact on livelihoods, which is quite an important distinction. It's not about, small and beautiful is not about every single kind of finance that's coming out from China. It is about specific areas of finance and cooperation coming from China. So that provides a great deal of clarity going forwards for African governments around the kinds of projects that you're going to be looking for and going to be pitching, in a sense, for Chinese development assistance, for example, through the Global Development Fund or through other types of mechanisms with the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Health. Those need to be small and beautiful. Not everything, but those ones really need to be small and beautiful. They need to have a positive impact on livelihoods and poverty reduction. And then last but not least, just a couple of new things that came out, a shift from having numbers of different types of projects to an actual acreage target. So this is quite an experimentation, right? You know, we see experimentation through FOCAC as well. We'll see if this sticks to the next one, if it works. But that's the agricultural demonstration areas becoming more about the acreage that it covers. And then this one about having 1,000 members of African political parties to China to talk about party and state governments. So again, that's a very interesting outcome, and again is going to be interesting to see how that really plays out and whether that will continue next time as well, and what it looks like in reality. So to conclude and use the outcomes as a means to think about what next. Number one message: the African continent, African countries will remain important to China, and China will remain important to Africa. FOCAC 9 100% clears that up. No question. And literally across every single government, apart from Eswatini, every African government has said, you're going to be important to us, to China. The second key point is that there is confidence from both the Chinese side and the African side that there is a good pipeline of projects, both foreign direct investment and also lending projects, or even institutions, we'll talk a little bit about that, that Chinese finance can go into over the next 3 years. That confidence is both from the Chinese side and from the African side. Otherwise, it wouldn't appear in the scaling up 10 to 30, or 20 to of 10 to 20, etc. That scaling up just wouldn't appear. So that confidence is there. And African governments have consistently said that's what they feel is very special about Chinese finance, and they still want that from their interaction with China. As I mentioned, a third outcome, small is beautiful, is development cooperation related, not necessarily lending, of course. Yes, lending should have positive impacts on development, but it's not absolutely required. And lending does not have to be small. There is a much stronger emphasis, the fourth point, there's a much stronger emphasis on clean energy. That is reflecting African aspirations, and also connectivity and digital projects as well. The question is that going to be enough to lead to modernization? What kinds of impact will all of that have over the next 3 years? Will it lead towards, will it be the kind of impact that it needs to? But that, especially clean energy projects, where a lot of clean energy projects at the moment, many are directed towards residential use rather than industry use and so on. So that will be something quite interesting to see whether we can get the highest innovations possible onto the continent for large-scale clean energy. The fifth point for next steps is that we can expect that trade deficits are not going to necessarily close, but what we will see is a continued diversification of African exports to China. And the only way that will have trade deficits really close is through structural transformation of increasing industrialization on the African continent. That modernization to a degree. So I think that's, the trade measures, they open access, etc., but they're not going to be the way that we see trade deficits close. There's a structural issue underlying that, and I think that's been accepted on both sides. The penultimate point, we will likely, because of the foreign direct investment target, and I said this pipeline, as I mentioned, we will likely see more factories moving to the African continent from China. We will likely see more investment in value addition. Will it be enough? 10 billion is good, but actually you need even more for serious structural transformation. So is there going to be enough foreign direct investment flowing? It's a decent pipeline likely to come. We actually saw quite a lot of new investment from Chinese firms in 2023 itself and at the beginning of 2024, including in things like cement factories and all sorts of things. However, is it going to be enough to really start to see that shift in structural transformation? We're going back into 2019, pre-COVID. Can we keep up? Can we kind of reignite that momentum and keep it up in a way that does actually lead to major change? And I think that's going to be a massive question over the next 3 years. And linked to that, the final point around while continuously we do see a strengthening of African agency and African institutions African governments in terms of their asks with regards to China in terms of their preparation, that pipeline wouldn't exist if African governments hadn't been preparing them, or if African institutions hadn't been preparing them, and if they weren't stronger themselves post-COVID. However, we will only really see that structural transformation if you do have even more African strengthening and African agency strengthening. So I think that is going to be key. As I mentioned, there's a lot more flexibility with all of the announcements, with many of the announcements, especially financial announcements in for FOCAC 9. That flexibility can be useful because it can allow African organizations to come in and say, hey, we know we've got some ideas, we can make things happen. But at the same time, it also means that if you don't get in quickly, you snooze, you lose, right? And so it is up to African organizations not to snooze and to work hard to deliver on this, as well as Chinese counterparts who are ready. So on that note, I will say thank you very much. Thank you for the time today. And I hope that gives you a bit of an indication of what we will see over the next 3 years. But also, as I said, we've got this vision document for 2035 that also provides the overall framing, and everything in FOCAC 9 doesn't look like it's changed from achieving that vision. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Hannah, thank you so much. So, actually, that's our strategy. We do not need to go to FOCAC, but we know what whole FOCAC is about. You know, we have the whole picture today after Hannah's talk. So thank you so much for that. You gave us a very good summary. And some items are in depth, so I think that is very helpful. I understand that that we have not seen online questions yet. People, you please be patient. So let me kick off, and then we will ask you. Yeah, I know you have. You have. So let me kick off. Can I kick off the question? Yeah. You know, I'm a chair, so today. So yesterday you did not allow me to speak. So so Hannah, it came to my mind that when you summarize your talk, you mentioned the first message is that the relationship remains. But my question is, they always have a kind of relationship. I think, do you think the relationship remains, or the relationship was leveled up to the next level? If that is the case, can you say a little bit more about what the new relationship is? If you agree with me that the relationship has been changed, yeah? So what is that? What is the difference between the previous one, let's say, between the relationship, let's say COVID is the benchmark. So what are the differences in terms of the relationship? So that's my first question. Do you want to respond? And then I come up with the second. I think I like the conversation type. It's more like, yes. So Hannah?
Yeah, so thanks. I think it remains, but it doesn't stay the same necessarily. I think there's elements that remain the same, and especially from the African perspective, the aspiration is that it will remain at least the same, in the sense of you know, things like finance and trade and so on will continue. But I think both on the Chinese side and also on the African side, foreign policy is evolving, and it's complex, sometimes quite obscure. And certainly from the Chinese foreign policy point of view of, things like all weather and the upgrading of as I mentioned, I think those suggest that there will be more closer understanding of foreign policy goals between China and African countries, that there's more sharing of foreign policy goals and working towards having shared foreign policy goals that was perhaps not really there before. And I think that's also an interesting context for having, political parties, more political parties coming into China, et cetera, in the exchange with them, because that's exactly what that leads to, exactly what the political party exchange will lead to more understanding of, how does the Chinese foreign policy system work? How does the African foreign policy system work, and so on. So I think that will be, I think that does mean there is a shift, but whether we see that kind of show itself within the next 3 years, I don't know that there'll be tangible things that we can say we know more about, or that we can identify this has been, but we'll be able to, there should be more China literacy from the African side, and on the other side, more African literacy from the Chinese side, especially at the government level. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's what I want to hear. So it's more, it's not like the normal brothers. So now they are closer, I think.
Yes, it's definitely.
And closer and closer. Think about industrialization, modernization. And Anna, you also said that for finance, since I'm so interested in this finance thing, so everybody, I hope, people agree with me that we have seen a pattern that the finance, China's lending at least, to African countries has been declining, particularly after COVID-19. But you said that, we saw a little bit up this year. You saw that China is back. So my question is, yes, maybe China is back, but is this China the same as before in terms of financing?
Yeah.
Thinking about the Chinese domestic problems, thinking about the geopolitics factors here, and what do you think about it? Is China the same as before in terms of its willingness to give money to African countries, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So I think there are certain things that will be the same China.
Would be the same.
That would be the same. So, for example, I think one of the unique factors, we were talking about this at a conference that we held just after FOCAC, which was with the African multilateral financial institutions. They did their sort of first showcase in China, and we helped them to organize it. One of the special aspects about Chinese financial organizations has been, in a sense, their lack of unfair risk aversity when it comes to African projects. Because I say risk aversity, but that's not just because, a lot of that risk aversity is not justified. And many African governments have made that very clear. We have Africa risk premiums and so on. And so that's one of the reasons why we have seen China being able to finance projects that were dreams in the 1970s and 60s and only now become realities. I think that China is still going to be there. And even some of the projects that are under discussion right now are still some of those projects are in the new pipeline. But at the same time, I think the difference is that even if the scale might be similar, there is a stronger, I think there's a stronger need on both sides to be clearer about the benefits and outcomes of those projects. It's not that you're not going to be able to justify a train, right? You will be able to justify a train. There's no reason why you shouldn't. Trains are highly justifiable on the African continent. We're almost four times the size of China. We need trains. But what you need to do is make the business case very clear to the Chinese public, the African public, and be really clear why this is both in. So you need to be more active, even at the beginning. So it's not like we're learning that these projects are going to be difficult, etc. I mean, I always find that a very sort of superior attitude, as if Chinese banks don't know how to finance. Have you been to China? But at the same time, you still need to manage in a slightly different way. So manage proactively those projects and what they're going to deliver.
Hannah, thanks. I understand you. So I still have one question, but I will reserve my question. I will give the chance to the floor. Wow, we have a lot of hands now. Amelia, I'm not like you, so you go first. And yeah, when you were chairing, so you behaved. So so please, you go first, and then we will pick up other people. Yeah.
This is like the relationship between China and Africa.
Yeah.
Hannah, thank you so very much. My name is Amelia. I'm not a finance person, I'm a lawyer, but I do investment law. And I'm just sort of wondering, you had talked about both China and African countries coming a little bit closer and getting to understand each other better. So I'm just wondering, did African countries give anything back? What is China getting out of all of this commitment? Because at some point, hopefully, something on the horizon is maybe would get to parity or equity or some level playing field as well. Because as we all know, if you keep taking without giving anything back, you remain the underdog and you have to comply. You know, he who pays the piper dictates the tune. I think that's the word. And so I was just wondering if in your view, there was anything that Africa put on the table.
So we do that. Maybe I collect two others, Hannah.
Okay.
Oh, I see. Forgot your name, actually. You just,
Leonce.
yeah, Leonce, can you please, yeah.
Thank you, Anna, for this presentation. So I'm Leonce Dr. Ano. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire. I'm an independent consultant. That was very insightful, but I've seen from your presentation that it looks like China is very looking towards the public sector, while I think because of the political structure in Africa, that's towards democracy, that's, to my view, impedes long-term planning. Unlike in the case of China, one way of making modernization happening is having a very strong private sector. And I'm not seeing that through the presentation of FOCAC. And I'm seeing with the Western organization, through the DFI, one of the ways they try to work with the private sector is to bring equity investment to de-risk some of the projects. So I really like your point toward the unfair risk perception of China. Are they looking towards how they can cooperate more with the private sector to de-risk the perception of the risk that they see? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we have another one. I saw Catherine. I mean, Richard, you are the supervisor. So I leave the chance to Catherine. So Catherine, can you please? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Hannah, for a very exciting presentation. It's good to get to know you and meet you in person. So 2 questions. It's kind of a twofold. Some of the speakers yesterday spoke about the China-Africa relationship that's kind of masculine, feminine. Having walked on both sides, the China side and the Africa side, what's your take on that relationship? Then secondly, your final point leads into Africa improving its institutions in order to leverage the financing that's getting from China. From what you see across African governments, what do you think is like the current changes that are needed for us to propel that change? Thank you.
So I think we should stop here for 3 questions. So Hannah, could you please respond?
Really great questions. Thank you. So I think in terms of what's China getting, I think the point I was making earlier is it comes to that, you know, how can China describe domestically why it is engaging with African countries and move away from this notion that China's giving free money to African countries. The free money is maximum $1 billion, right? We see that of grants. But the rest is lending, and that's not China giving, that's African countries borrowing. Like, what is this? The framing is African governments are borrowing. It's not China giving, but China is making available lending, which it expects to deliver a higher return in Africa than it would deliver domestically, which is a good potential business case. But it is also up to African governments to make that business case. Yeah. I think the other aspect, we've also got to remember that many Chinese companies benefit significantly from the African markets, not just sales into the African markets, but also from construction. So of a lot of the lending has gone into, we know it's gone into projects which are then delivered by Chinese firms, and the also borrowing by African governments from other institutions also goes to Chinese firms can take advantage of that with their expertise and find, you know, have more jobs themselves. But again, we've got to remember that's also a benefit from the African side, because if construction is done faster, more cheaply, etc., that's good for Africans. We're spending less money on procurement. That's a good thing. But nevertheless, we still need to have a sort of long-term outlook. And again, that's where things like, if you've got Chinese companies benefiting from access to African markets, let's say for solar PVs or even for any other types of goods, in the end, what African governments have to be pushing is for how do we locally manufacture those things, because that's the ultimate goal. So I think there's still a lot more to do in terms of telling that story, but also telling that story within China, not just externally. The public sector focus, I think there is a very strong public sector focus. And again, that's because FOCAC, especially in terms of the outcomes and deliverables, tend to be mainly government to government bilateral. But there is, we saw even from COVID-19, there was more experimentation, an increase in financing that was channeled through African DFIs or African multilateral financial institutions. And we expect that to continue. And African multilateral financial institutions have been very strong in terms of private sector engagement, equity, debt, etc., with private sector. So I think we can expect them to facilitate a lot of the African side engagement, African private sector engagement. It's hard for the Chinese funds to do that, because the Chinese funds have a specific mandate, which is to help Chinese companies work in Africa. So even if you have a Chinese company that's partnering with an African company, you still can't go to something like CAFIC or CAD Fund unless the Chinese partner is the majority owner. So that's where the African multilateral financial institutions really offer something very special. And what we're also seeing is, again, this flexibility, the creativity. We saw some panda bonds being experimented with. Panda bonds have been experimented with for a long time in China, but the first African panda bond was issued last year in Egypt, and it was underwritten through AIB and AFDB. So these are new trends which we can look out for, but again, can also leverage in terms of the private sector and the African private sector in particular. Last but not least, the questions on masculine and feminine. I think the aspiration is for African countries in general, with all of our foreign partners, to be in the driving seat. It can be challenging to do that, especially because of the way that a lot of our development cooperation is framed. Just like the example I gave you of, is Chinese lending, is African borrowing, you know, our agency. So it's going to take a long time to unpack, but also demonstrably unpack that in terms of how the relationship functions. But I think it's certainly possible for more, I guess, equal feelings and expectations to be coming across. But we do need, for example, African governments to be talking more clearly about what are the benefits that they are offering. Exactly, coming back to your question, what are the benefits that they're offering to China? What are the benefits they're offering to other development partners? Because we obviously do offer a lot of benefits to every single development partnership, but it's just never really talked about in that frame. And what can we do? One, yes, talk, give those narratives, use those narratives more intentionally, but also in terms of strengthening our institutions. If we're talking about FOCAC, one of the unique aspects about FOCAC is that there is an African co-chair. Most of the Africa Plus One summits do not have an African co-chair. It's one of the defining features of China-Africa cooperation. And it does mean we have a lot more leverage, actually, in terms of setting the agenda than we do with many of the other Africa Plus One relationships and summits. The new co-chair, so the previous co-chair was Senegal. They were the co-chair for 6 years. It's always been a 6-year rotation. That is changing. It's now going to be a 3-year rotation. But there's a recognition that Central Africa has still not chaired for 6 years. So we have 2 Central African countries that are going to co-chair for the next 6 years, starting off with Republic of Congo, who's a new co-chair. And then the next one will be Equatorial Guinea, our only Spanish-speaking country on the continent.
Nice.
Which is exciting.
We have more questions now.
Sure.
So thank you very much. I appreciate your interest in this topic, but I need to be a little bit inclusive. We have a lot of questions, quite a few questions online now. So I would say we do not have time to answer all the questions, but can I just pick one question? But Hannah, please check online. A lot of compliments. They mentioned you only.
Thank you.
So. So thank you very much, online friends. So let me pick up one question, which is very much related to what you repeated a lot of time. You said, okay, it's not really China gave you money, it's China lends you money, it's African countries are borrowing money.
Yes.
But the problem is some of them are not able to repay the money. So therefore, there is a debate about the debt problem. So who is responsible for that? Is the China who should suffer from this, or is African countries who should be blamed? So can you talk, that's one of the questions that I think I need to pick up from online. So briefly, Hannah, I saw the next panel members are coming. So what about the debt problem?
Yeah. It's a really good one. And as I said, there is some flexibility in the language of FOCAC, which enables some things like debt swaps, etc. But remember, debt swaps are usually quite small in comparison to overall debt. So they might alleviate a little bit and provide some fungibility, but they're not the full answer. I think with regards to the overall question of who's responsible, you know, if debt is very cheap, you can take a lot of debt. You can take debt that you don't have to repay back in 200 years, no problem. You won't have a problem with repayment if your repayment period is that long. The problem is that we have quite short repayment periods. 40 years is still a short time for patient capital, for big infrastructure projects. 40 years is what IDA rates are, but they're not enough. They used to be 50, and then the World Bank changed. But with China, of course, there are some of the projects do have higher repayment and shorter maturities, etc. But again, for many middle-income countries, they don't have access to anything else of that kind of level of cheapness. So it is this balance of, can African governments really negotiate and use this opportunity of China being back to try to negotiate for lower interest rates and longer term repayments for all of the borrowing that they do? That is the answer, in my view. That is the answer for every single entity, not just China. And it is, it is the responsibility of both the creditor and the borrower to try to ensure that. Because if you're a creditor, if you're a creditor, you should be trying to make it easy for your borrower to repay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are already, sorry, yeah, I'm here. So I think we are already a little bit running out of the time for this session. But everybody enjoyed, so we are still enjoying. So we need more, but given the time constraints, I would like to close this session. And please join me to thank Hannah for the wonderful, insightful. Yes, thank you very much, Hannah. Really nice. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation and great questions.
Yeah, thank
It's a
you.
pleasure.
The chair for the next session.